Hey there. I welcome you once again. Today, I've got something truly special in store for you, a tale of bravery and boundless love. It's a story about a father and son united in purpose as they embark on a quest to hunt down the dark forces that threaten their world. So sit back, take a deep breath, and relax because this story is one you're going to love. It was the year 2000, a time when the world was buzzing with the fear of a new millennium, but for me, it was just another year in the woods of Michigan. The kind of year where the air smelled of pine and damp earth. To most people, the year brought worry about Y2K, but for my dad and me, it meant another hunting season. I was 14 then, and my life was anything but ordinary. While other kids worried about video games, school dances, and the latest trends, I was learning how to track creatures that most people wouldn't even dare to dream about. My father, Eli Mercer, was no average man. He had the kind of reputation that made people look twice. He was a mercenary in disguise, a bounty hunter with a specialty in the supernatural. Monsters. Cryptids. Things that lurked in the dark corners of the world. And me? I was his son, raised in the wilderness, trained to follow in his footsteps, though I was still figuring out exactly what that meant. That year was different. It was the year I stopped being just the kid trailing behind my dad in the woods. It was the year I saw the Wendigo, something that would change everything. Something that would make me understand that there was no going back from the path I had started to walk with my father, where darkness and blood were as much a part of our legacy as the love we shared. This is where my story begins, the year when I realized just how deep the Mercer legacy ran, and how much my father's shadow would shape me as I stepped into the dangerous world of bounty hunting. It's funny, how the folks around here always thought my dad was some sort of a myth, or maybe a legend himself. I mean, the guy's a solid, rock-hard wall of grizzled toughness. Eli Mercer, ex-Marine, bounty hunter, and when you've got the reputation of hunting down things that most folks would only see in their nightmares, people start to wonder if you're even human. He'd walk around the neighborhood, with his boots slapping the concrete, his flannel shirt rolled up just enough to show off the biceps. Dad's arms were like tree trunks, and I'm talking oak, not pine. I swear, every time he stepped out of the house, the neighbors would swoon. Yeah, you heard that right. I could see it. Those wide-eyed glances from the women on our block. Mrs. Marlowe, Mrs. Davies, and even old Miss Hargrove, her glasses would practically fall off when she'd catch sight of him. But let's be real here, Dad wasn't much for small talk, especially when it came to flirty neighbors. The poor ladies would try, though. I could almost hear their conversations drifting across the yard like, "Eli, you ever think of coming by for a coffee? I make a mean pecan pie," or, "Oh Eli, you really ought to come help me with the gutters sometime." Dad would grunt in that way he does, that low rumble from his chest like a bear warning you to back off before it gets angry. And they just laugh nervously, thinking it was some joke. But if you looked closely enough, you'd see the corners of his mouth twitch, like he was holding back a grin. Maybe it was his way of letting them know he knew what was going on, or maybe he just wasn't interested. Either way, it was hilarious. I'd just stand there, arms crossed, watching the whole thing go down. My dad was a good man, tough as nails. And no matter how many times the ladies flirted, they knew he was married to one thing only, the hunt. Growing up with my dad, Eli Mercer, wasn't exactly what you'd call normal. At least not if you looked at the rest of the neighborhood. Most of the dads I knew were pretty simple. They worked 9 to 5, they came home, cracked open a beer, and spent the evening watching TV with their families. But not my old man. No sir. My dad had this way of keeping to himself, mysterious even. He wasn't one of those dads who'd stand out at the front of the yard, shooting the breeze with the other guys on the block. He was a man of few words, and when he did speak, it was usually just one line of gruff, direct honesty. No sugarcoating it. At 14, I thought I knew everything about him. How you couldn't grow up under the same roof as Eli Mercer and not learn a thing or two. But still, there were days when I'd catch him staring off into the distance, and I could tell there was something on his mind, something he wasn't talking about. Sure, the neighbors all had their assumptions about him. Some thought he was a mercenary, a retired soldier, maybe even a private contractor. He certainly had the look for it. Rugged, a little rough around the edges, but never truly dangerous unless he needed to be. The rumors were as thick as the woods up here in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. When people in our small town of Sault Ste. Marie saw my dad, They didn't think bounty hunter. No, they thought of a man who walked the line between legal and illegal, a man who got his hands dirty in ways most folks couldn't even imagine. But the thing is, my dad never let anyone get too close. He had a way of keeping himself and his work just a little too mysterious to fully figure out. That's probably what kept the neighbors at arm's length. They'd wave when they saw him outside, of course, but you could always tell they were looking at him with those wide, suspicious eyes. I could practically hear their thoughts as they watched him. Is he for real? What's he really up to? Our house wasn't like the others either. Dad didn't just have a regular garage. He had a whole training facility inside our house. This wasn't some casual workout space. No, it was like walking into a professional gym mixed with a military training ground, designed for one thing, preparing for whatever was lurking out there in the wild. In the middle of our garage, there was a heavy-duty punching bag hanging from the rafters, its leather worn and faded. I used to stand there, pretending to hit it, but I never had the same kind of raw power Dad did. His punches? They had a weight behind them that made even the bag shudder when he went to work. He had a shooting arena too, hidden away in the back of the house. Not many people knew about it except for me. It wasn't just a shooting range, it was practically a fortress of solitude. Inside, the walls were lined with targets, some riddled with bullet holes from hundreds of rounds fired, and others where Dad had meticulously tested his accuracy. The whole space smelled of gunpowder and oil, a scent that, for some reason, always made me feel like I was stepping into another world. The kind of world where people got paid for putting bullets into things that needed taking out. We'd spend hours there together, me watching as he set up his Remington 700, or loading his silver-plated .44 Magnum revolver with a smooth, practiced hand. There was something about the way he handled those guns that gave me chills. He wasn't just shooting for fun, he was preparing for something bigger, something that came with a price. Dad wasn't a car guy, but he did have a few vehicles that got the job done. The main one was an old black Dodge Ram 2500, painted matte and with mud stains all over it from the countless times it had navigated the narrow, snow-packed roads of Michigan's rural countryside. That truck was like an extension of him, big, tough, and no-nonsense. There was also his backup vehicle, a 1970s Ford Mustang that had a bit of shine left on it, tucked away in the corner of the garage. He kept it mostly as a hobby, but I could tell that car was his way of holding on to something from a past that no one ever really talked about. The funny thing about Dad was that, in a way, he was a mercenary of sorts, but not in the way most people thought. He wasn't some faceless hired gun out there taking contracts from shady organizations. No, he hunted things that people didn't even believe in. He hunted things that weren't just human, and that's what made him different from the rest of the guys you'd meet down on Fifth Street. He was, in a way, a soldier for a war that didn't have headlines or news stories. A bounty hunter, in disguise, hunting supernatural entities in the wilds of Michigan's wilderness. But the thing that made him truly mysterious was the fact that he never talked about it. Never told anyone what he did for a living. The only clue I ever had came from a few whispered conversations in the dead of night, when Dad thought I was asleep. I'd hear him talk on the phone, always with an edge in his voice, as if whoever he was talking to wasn't someone you just invited over for a barbecue. He'd mention names that made no sense to me. Wendigo, Skinwalker, Sasquatch, and then I'd hear the click of the phone as he hung up, just like that, as if he was done talking. Sometimes, I'd get a glimpse of something darker in his eyes. There were days when I'd see him staring at the woods just beyond our backyard, like he could hear something coming for us. Something big. And I'd ask him about it, but he'd always just shake his head and say, "Stay out of the woods, Caleb." But I couldn't help myself. There was something pulling me toward those woods. And whatever it was that Dad was hiding, I was determined to figure it out. One thing was for sure, my dad, Eli Mercer, wasn't just any man. He was something else. Something more. One day, when I was 14, Dad decided it was time to take me on my first hunt. I didn't know what to expect at the time, but I knew it wasn't going to be like any hunting trip I'd ever been on. It wasn't going to be about tracking deer or bagging an elk for the freezer. No, this hunt was different. This was going to be something bigger. Something more dangerous. My old man didn't say much about what we were tracking, just that I should pack light, be prepared for anything, and keep my eyes open. That was the closest he came to an explanation. I didn't get it then, but I get it now. The woods are different when you're hunting something that doesn't belong there. Something not human, something ancient, something hungry. We drove north from Sault Ste. Marie, past the familiar stretch of Highway 123, and deeper into the heart of the Hiawatha National Forest. The landscape began to change as we left behind the small-town sprawl, and the road twisted through dense stretches of pines, towering trees that loomed like silent giants watching over us. I was used to the woods, but this was different. There was a strange stillness in the air. It wasn't the quiet of a calm morning, but the quiet that comes when something is watching you from the shadows. I could feel it. My gut was telling me something was off, but I just didn't know what. It wasn't until we stopped the truck and Dad turned to me with a serious look in his eyes that I understood we weren't hunting ordinary game. "Caleb," he said, voice low, "we're tracking something that's been terrorizing this area. Something old. It goes by a lot of names. But around here, they call it the Wendigo." My first instinct was to laugh. The Wendigo? You know, the creature from those old Native American legends? The one that was supposed to be this gaunt, starving monster with insatiable hunger? I thought Dad was messing with me, trying to scare me. But when I looked into his eyes, I knew he wasn't joking. This wasn't some bedtime story. This was real. He handed me my rifle and we started moving. The day was overcast, the sun fighting through heavy clouds. The air was thick with humidity, but it was cold in a way that made me shiver. We followed a trail of broken branches, twisted trees, and the unmistakable signs of something large moving through the underbrush. The scent in the air had changed too. There was a faint stench of rot, something decayed. For the next several days, we moved deeper into the woods, following the tracks and signs left behind by the creature. I had never felt more alive and terrified at the same time. My heart raced every time we stopped to inspect the fresh claw marks on trees or the strange footprints in the mud that were too wide for anything I'd seen in these woods before. Dad barely spoke, only giving me the occasional nod or grunted instruction as we set up camp each night. The tension in the air was palpable. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my nerves on edge. It felt like we were being hunted, like the creature was circling us, waiting for the right moment. But we couldn't turn back. Dad had a job to do, and we were in this together. On the fourth day, we came across something that sent a chill down my spine: bones. Human bones. The remains of a man, stripped down to the bone and scattered around an old fire pit. There was something wrong about it, something that made my stomach twist in knots. The bones were gnawed on, chewed through in places. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from the camp. Just this eerie silence. I asked Dad what it meant, but he only said, "We're close now." The following night, as we sat in our camp with the fire crackling between us, I heard it, a sound that sent every hair on my neck standing straight up. It was a distant, guttural growl, followed by a series of low, dragging noises. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear or something. But then came the scream, a high-pitched, blood-curdling wail that echoed through the trees. My heart nearly stopped. Dad stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the dark line of trees beyond our camp. He handed me my rifle. "Stay close," he said in a voice that was sharp as a knife. "It's here." That night we saw it. The Wendigo. I didn't believe it at first. What I saw was something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, with thin, spindly arms and legs that twisted unnaturally. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, like a corpse left out in the sun for too long. Its face didn't look like anything human. Its eyes were black, hollow pits, and its mouth was filled with jagged, razor-sharp teeth that were too big for its face. As it moved, it made this strange clicking noise, like bones snapping, as if its body wasn't meant to bend that way. The thing stared at us, those eyes gleaming with hunger. It was as if it could smell our fear, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Dad raised his rifle, aiming at the creature, but it was too fast. Before I knew it, the Wendigo had lunged into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. That was when I realized this wasn't some old folktale. This was real. This creature, this Wendigo, was as much a part of this forest as the trees themselves. Over the next few days, we continued to track it, following its trail through the woods. It was like a twisted game of cat and mouse. The creature was clever, always staying one step ahead of us, always watching from the shadows. The hunt was thrilling in a way I couldn't explain, a rush of adrenaline that kept me awake at night, wondering when it would strike again. It was a week later, after hours of walking through the dense Michigan woods, that we finally found it. It was holed up in a cave beneath an old rock formation, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The night we saw it, I thought I was dreaming. The whole thing felt like some twisted nightmare that I couldn't wake up from, but when I looked at my dad, his face was dead serious. No smile. No sarcastic remark. Just raw focus, like a soldier on a mission, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a hunt. It was a battle for survival. We didn't speak when the Wendigo vanished back into the trees. There was no point in talking. We both knew what had just happened, and I think we both realized that we were in over our heads. The creature was faster than we had anticipated. Stronger. More elusive. As the night stretched on, I kept my rifle raised, my eyes darting through the woods, expecting it to pounce from the shadows at any second. But it didn't. Instead, we spent the rest of the night circling the area, checking for any signs of the creature, but it was gone. It had disappeared like it was a ghost, a shadow that never truly existed. My heart was still racing from the sight of those hollow eyes staring into me, but Dad didn't show it. He didn't flinch or hesitate. He just gave me a curt nod, signaling that we should move out. "We'll track it in the morning," he said, voice cold but steady. "Get some rest. This thing is smart. It's going to try and play with us." That night, we camped out in the woods. We couldn't risk moving deeper into the forest in the dark, not with a creature like that lurking around. The trees were so thick, you could barely see 10 feet in front of you, and every crackle of leaves underfoot made my heart jump. I helped Dad set up a fire, its flickering light casting long shadows across the underbrush, creating an almost unreal atmosphere around us. The firelight danced across Dad's face, highlighting the hard lines of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes. We didn't have a tent, just sleeping bags spread out on the ground beneath the canopy of trees. I pulled mine closer to the fire, though it didn't do much to cut the cold. It wasn't just the chill in the air that got to me, it was the silence. The kind of silence that suffocates you. The kind where every movement feels like a signal that something's watching you, waiting for the right moment. Dad sat on a log beside the fire, a flask in his hand. He unscrewed the top and took a swig, before passing it to me. I hesitated. I wasn't much of a drinker. I was only 14. But something in the air felt different. I could see the edge of worry in his eyes, a rare crack in his usual tough guy demeanor. So I took it from him. "Just a sip," he said, his voice gruff. "It'll take the edge off." I took a cautious sip, the burn of the whiskey warming me from the inside out. I coughed, and Dad let out a low chuckle, a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness of the woods. "It gets easier the more you drink," he said, then looked out into the dark. "You're gonna need something to handle the shit we're about to face. Might as well start now." There was no humor in his voice, just the calm, steady tone that had seen him through God knows how many hunts. The kind of hunts where people didn't come back. I sat down beside him, both of us watching the fire burn low. The warmth from the flames seemed to make the night feel less oppressive, but my mind was still racing. What had we just seen? Was it real? Dad didn't speak for a long time. I think he was waiting for me to say something, anything, but I didn't know where to start. How do you even begin to talk about something like that? A monster. A thing from the dark that shouldn't exist. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dad spoke, his voice low and careful. "The Wendigo," he began, "it's been around a long time. Not just a myth, Caleb. Not a story to scare kids around a campfire. It's real. A thing born of hunger, cursed with an insatiable thirst that never goes away. They say the spirit of a cannibal can turn into one of them." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean, cannibal?" He took another swig from his flask and passed it to me again. This time, I took a bigger drink, feeling the fire burn deeper in my throat. A long time ago, some of the people around here, Native American tribes mostly, had to fight them. They say if a person was desperate enough, starving enough, they'd turn to eating others. And that's when the Wendigo takes over. It's not just a man anymore. It's something else. He paused, glancing over at me, his eyes narrowing. I know it sounds crazy, kid, but I'm telling you, there's more to the world than what you see on the surface. People like us? We hunt those things. We stop them before they get to anyone else. I nodded, but inside I was still trying to process it. The idea of a man turning into something that could rip you apart with those long claws didn't seem possible. And yet, here I was, sitting with my father, knowing that the thing we were hunting had done exactly that. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the trees, the wind whispering through the branches, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That something was out there watching us. Dad must have sensed it too, because he slowly stood up, his hand resting on the grip of his Remington 700. He didn't say a word, but he motioned for me to stay close. I grabbed my rifle and followed him, my feet light but my chest heavy with dread. For hours, we sat there, keeping watch over the fire. No words were exchanged. It wasn't necessary. The silence between us spoke volumes. This was father and son time, but not the kind you'd expect. No jokes, no stories about girls at school, no lessons about life. This was a different kind of bonding. One born out of necessity. One where every second you weren't paying attention could be your last. Somewhere in the distance, the wind picked up, and we both heard it. A distant growl. Almost like a bear, but not quite. I saw Dad tense, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The hunt was on. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. Dad's eyes were sharp, scanning the shadows beyond our camp, the same way he'd trained me to look for things no one else could see. Every rustle in the brush, every snap of a twig, my body went rigid, my rifle tight in my hands. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the Wendigo or of disappointing Dad. That distant growl came again. Closer this time. It wasn't the sound of a bear or any animal I knew. It sent a cold shiver crawling up my spine, the kind that makes you want to run and never look back, but I stayed. Dad stayed. We had no choice. Dad motioned for me to follow him. His footsteps were silent as he moved through the underbrush, and I did my best to match his pace, but my boots were loud compared to his. Every step I took, I felt like it was announcing our presence to whatever was watching us. We moved in a wide circle, staying downwind, but the creature was clever. It knew we were following. We couldn't find its tracks, couldn't smell its scent. It had become the forest itself, blending into the shadows. The kind of predator that wasn't just hunting you, it was trying to make you hunt it. And it was damn good at it. At some point I lost track of time. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, the sky darkening as the hours slipped by. I didn't want to admit it, but fear started creeping in. The forest felt alive with it, like the trees were closing in, watching, waiting. We paused by an old rotting log. Dad knelt, checking the ground. His fingers moved across the dirt, tracing faint scratches in the soil. "It's close," he muttered, his voice low. Before I could respond, I heard it. A snap of a branch, followed by that guttural growl. It was behind us, closer than ever. I turned, but I couldn't see anything. The trees were too thick, the darkness too deep. "Stay close," Dad whispered, and I heard the shift in his voice, the tension, the readiness. He pulled out a silver-tipped bullet and loaded it into his rifle. The air felt heavier, as if the very forest was holding its breath. We moved again, more cautiously now. I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck, the lump in my throat growing bigger. My heart pounded in my chest. Every step we took felt like a countdown. I didn't know when the Wendigo would show itself, but I knew it was coming. The next sound was louder. A crash. Something moving fast through the trees. And then I saw it. It was a blur at first, too fast for me to make out, but then it stopped. The Wendigo. Its eyes, those black, empty holes, locked onto mine. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, like it was made of death itself. Its mouth opened wide, revealing jagged teeth, glistening in the faint light. Before I could even raise my rifle, it moved. Faster than anything I'd ever seen. It was on Dad first, swiping at him with long, clawed hands that cut through the air with terrifying speed. Dad barely had time to react. He fired once, a shot that should have hit, but the Wendigo just took it. The creature didn't even flinch. It was so close now, too close. I could hear its breath, heavy and rattling, like it was starving. The air turned cold, colder than it should have been in the middle of a Michigan summer night. Dad shoved me back, shouting for me to get out of the way. I didn't know if it was instinct or fear, but I ran, looking for cover. The Wendigo didn't follow me, it was too focused on Dad. It lunged again, and this time, it hit him hard, knocking him to the ground. The rifle flew from his hands, and I watched in horror as the creature swiped at him with its claws. Dad tried to fight back, using his fists, but the Wendigo was too strong. I took a breath, steadied my hands, and aimed. I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out in the night. The Wendigo screamed, this high-pitched, horrible scream that made my blood run cold. The bullet grazed its shoulder, but it didn't slow down. It turned, snarling, and in a blink, it was gone. The silence after the creature disappeared was worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that drags on forever, stretching and stretching until it feels like the world has stopped. I ran to Dad. He was on the ground, blood trickling from a deep cut on his arm. His face was pale, but his eyes were still sharp. "That thing," he panted, "it's not just fast. It's smart. We can't keep doing this, not like this." I didn't know what to say. I felt helpless. We had been so close to ending it, but the Wendigo had won this round. Dad pulled himself up with a grunt, wiping the blood from his face. He grabbed his rifle, though it was shaky in his hands. He didn't look at me, didn't say anything. The only thing I could hear was my heart pounding in my chest and the distant growl of the Wendigo somewhere out in the dark. "We'll get it," Dad said finally. His voice was rough, but there was a fire in it I hadn't seen before. He wasn't going to let this thing win. We spent the next few hours tracking it again, but it was like the Wendigo was playing with us. It led us in circles, always just out of reach, always watching. It was smarter than we were, and it knew the woods better than we ever would. By the time we set up camp again, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The night felt longer this time, like it was never going to end. I could hear the Wendigos growl in the distance, but we didn't move. We couldn't. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, my mind racing. How could we possibly beat something like this? What had I gotten myself into? Dad's hand was steady when he passed me the flask again. He didn't say a word, but I could feel the weight of his silence. This hunt had gone from dangerous to deadly, and he knew it. We both did. But there was no turning back now. We had to finish it. The fire flickered, its light barely cutting through the thick darkness around us. The night was colder now, and the woods felt heavier, like the trees themselves were closing in on us. I sat there, next to the fire, my hands still trembling from what we just faced. The Wendigo was still out there, somewhere in the dark, and I could feel it. The fear. It was like a weight on my chest, and the thought of it made my heart race. But my dad wasn't afraid. Not even a little bit. He had this way of carrying himself, like nothing could shake him. I wanted to be like that. I wanted to have that kind of strength, that kind of focus. He sat across from me, his rifle resting against his knee, and he looked at me for a long time without saying anything. I could see the blood drying on his arm where the Wendigo had scratched him, but he wasn't acting like it hurt. To him, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the hunt. He wasn't going to let that thing get away. Then, after what felt like forever, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You're scared, aren't you?" he asked, looking right at me. I didn't lie. I shook my head slowly. "Yeah." He nodded, like he understood. "Fear isn't something you can get rid of. Not in this line of work. You're going to feel it every time you go out there. Every time you face something like that," he pointed towards the dark, where we both knew the Wendigo was waiting. "But what matters is how you handle it." I felt the weight of his words sink in. It wasn't just fear of the creature we were hunting, but fear of failing. Fear of not being enough. I didn't want to disappoint him. I didn't want to freeze up when it really mattered. Dad took a deep breath, then turned to look at me, his gaze intense. "There's no room for error out here. Not when you're facing something like that." He pointed to his chest, tapping his fingers over his heart. Out here, your instincts will tell you everything you need to know. But it's up to you whether you listen to them. Fear will cloud those instincts. It'll make you hesitate. And hesitation? That gets people killed. I nodded, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Dad's voice softened just a bit. Listen, Caleb. When I started out, I was just like you. I still get scared sometimes. But you learn to control it. You don't let it control you. I looked at him, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was it really that simple? Just push the fear aside? Control it, Dad repeated, like he was reading my mind. You don't ignore it. You don't run from it. You use it. That's how you survive. He paused, staring into the fire for a moment, his face softening for the first time that night. When I was your age, I was in a situation just like this one, facing something I couldn't understand. I was scared out of my mind. But I kept going. And I learned something that stuck with me ever since. Every time you feel that fear, you ask yourself one thing. What's worse? Running, or standing your ground and finishing it? I didn't say anything. What could I say? He was right. The idea of running had crossed my mind. Hell, it had crossed both our minds more than once tonight. But that wasn't the way my dad operated. It wasn't the way I was supposed to either. He stood up slowly, dusting off his pants, and moved over to his rifle. He slid the silver-tipped bullets into the chamber one by one, like it was a simple task. But I knew it wasn't. It was like he was preparing for war. You've got the tools, Caleb, he said quietly, still focused on the rifle. You've got the training, the instincts. You've just got to trust them. Trust yourself. And when that thing comes at you again, you don't hesitate. You do what you've been trained to do. You don't freeze up. You shoot. You kill it. He handed me the rifle without another word, his eyes locked on mine. I took it, my fingers now steady. It felt different now, heavier in a way. Like it wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a promise. A responsibility. Tonight wasn't the end, son, Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's just the beginning. The beginning of you learning what it means to be a hunter. And you're gonna keep going because that's what we do. We don't stop. Not for fear. Not for anything. We keep going until it's done. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of something else, something that felt like resolve. Like I had something to prove. To him. To myself. I had a lot to learn, but tonight I learned something important. Fear wasn't something to run from. It was something to face head on. And the next time we came up against that Wendigo, I wasn't going to hesitate. I was going to be ready. Dad clapped me on the back hard enough that I felt it through my jacket. You've got this, he said, a rare smile breaking through his usual hard expression. You just need to believe it. I swallowed the lump in my throat, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't just a lesson in hunting, it was a lesson in life. Fear was never going to go away, but that didn't mean I had to be afraid of it anymore. I was ready for the next step. I was ready for whatever came next. The next few days were a blur of movement, adrenaline, and thoughts that raced faster than I could keep up with. The encounter had been a wake-up call. I thought I was prepared for the life Dad had trained me for, but I realized there was more to this than I ever imagined. It wasn't just about hunting monsters. It wasn't just about pulling the trigger. It was about surviving the things you couldn't see. The fear that could eat you alive if you let it. I didn't tell Dad how much I was struggling with the fear that still lingered from that night. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow eyes staring back at me, and I could feel my heart race again. It wasn't fear of the creature itself, but fear of failing. Fear of being too slow, too scared, too weak. I didn't want to let him down. Dad must have known. He didn't bring it up, but he pushed me harder. He didn't let me rest. Every day, he made me run harder, practice longer. Every time I hesitated, he was there to remind me that hesitation was the difference between life and death. And after everything that happened, I didn't need reminding. When we finally made the decision to track the Wendigo down once and for all, it wasn't just a simple decision. It was a reckoning. I was no longer just following in my father's footsteps. I was carving out my own path, one I knew I could walk without fear of looking back. The feeling was strange but empowering. My heart wasn't racing with dread anymore. It was racing with something else, a sense of purpose. I had accepted the reality of what I had become a part of. The morning was gray. The forest was quiet, too quiet. It was just Dad and me heading into the woods once again, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. "Ready?" Dad asked as he checked his gear one more time. I nodded, tightening my grip on the rifle in my hands. The weight of the weapon didn't feel as heavy now. It felt familiar, like it was an extension of my own body, like the metal and wood had become as much a part of me as my own arms and legs. I wasn't afraid anymore. I could feel it in my bones. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady. Dad gave me a quick look, then turned and led the way into the trees. The air was damp, thick with the smell of pine and wet earth. We followed the same trail we'd used before, the one the Wendigo had left behind. There were no more signs of it, but we both knew it was still there, watching us. The day passed slowly. We moved quietly, carefully, covering ground without making a sound. I kept my eyes peeled for any signs, broken branches, torn leaves, tracks in the dirt, but there was nothing. Just the deep, oppressive silence of the forest. After a few hours, I realized we weren't tracking the Wendigo anymore. We were tracking the feeling it left behind. The dread. The knowledge that it was still out there, somewhere, waiting for us to make the first mistake. And that was when I understood. This wasn't just about the hunt anymore. The Wendigo was just the physical manifestation of that darkness, but the true test was in how we faced it. It wasn't just a monster we were chasing. It was fear itself. We camped that night in a small clearing, just as we had done before. This time, however, there was no tension between us. No fear. We set up our fire, prepared our gear, and waited. Dad didn't talk much. Instead, he stared into the fire, his expression distant. I knew he was thinking about what came next, the kill, the end of this hunt. But more than that, I knew he was thinking about me. What I had learned. What I would learn. I kept my eyes on the fire, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Dad had always been so focused, so certain. But now I understood. It wasn't just about killing the Wendigo. It was about living with the knowledge of what you had to do to survive. How much of yourself you had to sacrifice. "You know, Caleb," Dad said, breaking the silence, "this job, this life, it's not about glory. It's about survival. It's about making sure the thing you're hunting doesn't come back to hurt someone else. You get good at it, and it becomes like second nature. But the thing is," he paused, glancing at me, "the thing is, you don't ever forget what it costs." I didn't need him to say it. I understood. The cost was your soul. Your humanity. But the alternative was something much worse. We spent the night in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. I could feel the Wendigo's presence now, like a shadow looming over us. I had to be ready, not just for the fight, but for everything that came after. The next day, we were back on the trail. The Wendigo's tracks had appeared again, faint but distinct. Dad led the way, and I followed, my focus sharp. The air was colder now, and the forest had grown darker, the trees pressing in on us as though the land itself was trying to hide the creature we sought. By late afternoon, we found it. The Wendigo. It wasn't just any creature. It was something out of nightmares. Its gaunt body stretched unnaturally thin, its ribs visible under the pale skin. Its eyes were black holes, empty and devoid of anything human. It crouched low in the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake. I felt the fear rise in my chest, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't paralyzing. It was the kind of fear you feel when you know you're about to face something impossible. But I wasn't going to let it take over. I remembered Dad's words, "There's no room for error." Dad didn't hesitate. He fired first, the shot ringing out through the trees. The Wendigo screeched, a high-pitched, unnatural sound that echoed through the woods. It charged toward us, moving faster than I thought possible. It lunged at Dad, its claws swiping through the air, but Dad was already moving, ducking and rolling to the side. I was ready. My rifle was aimed, steady. I fired. The shot hit, but the Wendigo barely flinched. It was still coming, but I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger again. And again. This time, the bullet found its mark. The Wendigo let out another screech, stumbling back. But it wasn't done. We fought it. Dad with his rifle, me with my modified Winchester, the silver-tipped bullets a last line of defense. The Wendigo's strength was incredible, but we were determined. And when the last shot was fired, the creature let out one final, blood-curdling scream before it collapsed, its body lifeless in the dirt. We stood there for a long moment, both of us catching our breath. Dad walked over and knelt down beside the creature, checking it for signs of life. "It was done. Good job," he said, his voice hoarse. "That's what you've been training for. You did it." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over me. It was over. We had done it. But the hunt wasn't finished yet. Dad began to prepare the creature's remains. There were certain procedures to follow, things only hunters like us knew how to do. We had to transport the Wendigo's body to a secret location, a place where other hunters, those who operated in the shadows, could handle the remains in their own way. No one else could know what we had killed. The world wasn't ready for the truth about what was really out there. We were the keepers of that secret. We traveled for hours, back through the woods, to a place deep in the mountains, where a hidden camp of hunters awaited. It was an old, abandoned cabin, its walls covered in layers of moss and ivy. Inside, the walls were lined with weapons, old relics, and maps of places I didn't recognize. It was a sanctuary for people like us, the ones who hunted what others feared. The other hunters didn't ask questions. They just accepted us. We dropped the Wendigo's remains onto a table, and they took over, performing the necessary rituals to ensure the body would never be found. No one could know. No one could understand. As we left the camp that night, the weight of the hunt behind us, I realized something. I had crossed a line. I had taken the first step into a world that most people would never see. And I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear I had felt before was gone. I had learned what it meant to survive in this world. I had learned what it meant to be a hunter. The journey to the secret hunter's camp wasn't a short one. After we had disposed of the Wendigo's remains in the hands of the other hunters, there was one final step left in this ritual. A buyer. Dad didn't speak about him much, but there was always a certain coldness in his eyes when he did. This wasn't just some random collector, it was a man who specialized in things that others only dared to whisper about. His name was Old Man Harrow, and he was a fixture in the hidden world of the supernatural, a man as much of a mystery as the things he collected. The night we arrived at the secluded cabin in the deep woods, Harrow was already there, sitting by the fire, the dim light from the flames flickering across his old, weathered face. He didn't stand when we walked in, his attention never wavering from the flames, but his sharp, gray eyes caught mine as soon as I stepped forward. "You're the boy," he said, his voice low, rasping like dry leaves scraping together. "The one your father's been training." I nodded, a little unsure of what to say. There was something about the old man that made me feel small, despite his frailty. It wasn't the way he looked, it was something in his eyes. The way they seemed to see straight through me, as though he already knew everything about me, about us, and about the world we hunted in. Dad moved forward, setting the remains of the Wendigo on the table between us. Harrow's eyes flickered to the creature's remains, but his face didn't shift, not even a hint of emotion. He didn't need to. He'd seen it all before. Harrow's fingers brushed against the body, inspecting it like a collector admiring a rare artifact. He turned his attention back to us, his thin lips curling into something close to a smile. "Impressive work," Harrow murmured. "It's always a pleasure when the blood runs so thick. It's a fine specimen. And you've brought it to the right place." Dad simply nodded, his face serious. He didn't need to say much. He and Harrow understood each other in ways that were hard for me to grasp. To most people, Harrow was just an old man. But in our world, he was someone to be respected, feared, even. I glanced around the cabin, noting the shelves lined with strange items, shrunken heads, dried herbs, jars filled with unidentifiable objects, and a map that stretched across one wall, with pins marking locations all over the country. Old relics. Monster parts. Things that only men like us understood the significance of. The other hunters didn't say anything when we entered the room. They just looked at me, sizing me up. I could feel their eyes on me as I stood there next to Dad, watching how they subtly nodded in approval. These men weren't used to dealing with newcomers, let alone a kid. But they weren't as dismissive as I thought they'd be. Instead, they watched quietly, like they were evaluating me. One of the older hunters, a tall man with a thick beard and a scar running across his face, gave me a respectful nod. His name was Griggs, and he had been hunting things longer than I had been alive. "You did good out there," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Not every kid gets to face something like that and come out standing." Another hunter, a younger guy with a buzz cut, smirked at me. He couldn't have been more than a few years older than me, but his eyes had the look of someone who had seen too many things. "That was one hell of a fight, kid. Never thought I'd see a Mercer in action." He said it like it was something to be proud of, but I could hear the respect in his tone. He wasn't dismissing me. "He's ready," Dad said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room stop talking. "He's got the instincts. And the will." The room grew quiet then, and I knew that my father's approval meant more than anything to them. He wasn't just a hunter. He was a legend. And in that moment, I wasn't just his son. I was part of the legacy. The legacy of the Mercers, of the hunters who tracked the things that hid in the dark corners of the world. As the conversation turned to business and the final arrangement for the Wendigos remains, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. I wasn't just a kid anymore. I wasn't just the son of Eli Mercer. I was becoming something more. Something that would stand on its own. I could feel the eyes of the other hunters on me, sizing me up, evaluating my worth. This was no game. This wasn't a choice I could take back. It was a way of life. Harrow didn't waste any time. He counted out a hefty sum of money, sliding it across the table, his hands shaking slightly from age but his grip firm. "The rest will be handled," he said, locking eyes with Dad. "You know the rules." Dad nodded and took the payment without a word. His eyes flicked to me as if saying, "This is how it is now. This is your life." And in that moment, it hit me harder than anything before. This wasn't just about hunting cryptids. It wasn't just about following Dad into the woods. It was a life. A reality. A dark, hidden world that I was part of now, whether I liked it or not. As we left Harrow's cabin and walked back into the woods, the evening air cooler now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside me. The fear was gone. But there was something else, something deeper, a weight I could feel in the pit of my stomach. I didn't know it at the time, but I was beginning to understand the true cost of what I had just chosen. This life wasn't without sacrifice. It wasn't without its darkness. When we returned to town, everything felt different. The town felt different. I had spent my whole life here, growing up with the same faces, walking the same streets. But now, it was as if I was seeing it through a new lens, through the eyes of someone who had been shown a whole different world. A world that most people couldn't even begin to understand. I walked into school the next day with a strange sense of detachment. High school kids, my classmates, were talking about the usual stuff. Parties, schoolwork, sports, drama. Nothing had changed for them. They were all wrapped up in their own little bubble, unaware of the things that lurked just beyond the edge of their reality. "Did you hear about last night's party?" Tim asked, walking up to me in the hallway. "You gotta come next time. It's gonna be insane." I gave him a blank look, my mind still back on the hunt. The Wendigo. The cold night air. The fire. The moment when I knew I wasn't just a kid anymore. "Yeah, sounds fun," I said, but it didn't feel right. "Not anymore." "What's up with you?" Tim asked, eyeing me with concern. "You seem off." I didn't have an answer for him. How could I explain what had really happened? How could I tell him that while he was worrying about his next test or what car he wanted to drive, I had been out in the woods, facing things that people only saw in nightmares? How could I make him understand that I wasn't like the rest of them anymore? That the things that used to scare me now seemed small and irrelevant compared to the dark truths I had come to know? "They're all clueless," I muttered under my breath as I walked away from him. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't just the people in high school who were ignorant. The whole world was. They didn't know what was really out there, what kind of monsters roamed the dark corners of the earth. They didn't know that there were men like my father, like me, who spent their lives hunting these creatures and making sure the things that go bump in the night stayed hidden. But that was the reality of the life I had chosen. The rest of the world would never understand. And honestly, they didn't need to. They could live in their little bubble, safe in their ignorance, while we kept the dark at bay. I was no longer just Eli Mercer's son. I was Caleb Mercer, the next in line to carry the legacy of the Hunters. And nothing, not even high school gossip or the clueless chatter of teenagers, would ever change that. Thank you guys for your time. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. See you with another story.